No se I see. Now see. Okay, fine. So welcome everyone. I am Vicky Murillo, the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University and faculty in the departments of Political Science and the School of International Affairs. And I want to welcome all of you to these exhibits of the pictures of Federico Rio, as well as to this important conversation about migration to the United States, both of which are sponsored by the School of International and Public Affairs and the Institute of Latin American Studies. Let me start by mentioning the Darien Gap, because I thought this morning and people didn't know what Darien was, and its long-standing relationship with the United States. So the Darien Gap is the isthmus that divides South America from Central America. It's that little piece of land, for those of you who do not know. I was told it's a very inhospitable region, and it seems to have been cutting flows from the south to the north from very early times in the region. It's also very close to the history of the United States, because it's currently part of Panama, a country that's the youngest in Latin America, and which was created because the US wanted a channel to cross from the Pacific to the Atlantic. So this, the Darien Gap is pretty close to us. It's pretty close to migration or difficulties of migration. It's being crossed, if you've seen the photographs outside, by migrants coming from the south, which often have gone first to other countries. A lot of Venezuelans, 1 million Venezuelans that have left the country. There's 28 million, population, so this is very significant. The majority of whom went to Colombia, 2.5 million in Colombia, 1.3 million in Peru, about 500,000 in Ecuador and in Chile, and a small fewer number, about 300,000 in Brazil and 200,000 in Argentina. So some of these Venezuelans, as well as Haitians, have also migrated south, are now coming north through the Darien, trying to reach the US. We're going to hear now about why and how these policies are shaped by the US, but Haiti, Nicaragua, and Cuba, along with Venezuela, are countries where the US cannot deport directly because of the relationship. So these people have been nonetheless deported to Mexico, to the northern Mexico frontier area, and we have heard a lot about this in this terrible fire that happened last week, where so many people lost their life in a detention center. We have the photograph of Federico Rios that, I invite everyone to see, and I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers, then give the word to Federico, who unfortunately is with us remote because of visa issues, who is going to tell us and also going to show us more pictures about what he learned in the process of making these pictures. Afterwards, I'm going to be posing questions to the panelists and then give questions to the audience. So let me just introduce as fast as possible this extraordinary panel. Federico Rio, the photographer, is a regular contributor to the New York Times, and his photos have been published in magazines such as Der Spiegel, Geo, Stern, Paris Match, and National Geographic. He focuses on Latin America, including the civil war in his home country of Colombia, among other things, and he has won prestigious awards in different countries such as Germany, Japan, and the US. One of his books was included in the collection of the New York Museum of Modern Art, and he has had exhibitions in many different countries. We also have with us Nadia Droz, who's a journalist and documentary filmmaker who works across print, radio, television, and documentary film. She's based in New York, following a decade in Bogota, Colombia. She continues to report from Latin America, often as a special correspondent for PBC News. Her reporting on an extraordinary journey of migrants from around the world who traversed the Darien Gap to reach the United States has won various accolades, including the Pulitzer Prize in feature writing for her piece in the California Sunday magazine, as well as an Emmy and Peabody Award for a television series produced with her partner, Bruno Federico, for the PBS News Hour. The two are currently co-directing a film about a former woman commander in the Colombia FARC guerrilla group. And Nadia, this is important to be mentioned, it's an alum from the Columbia School of Journalism. Thank you, Nadia, for joining us as well.
Thank you.
We also have with us Elora Mukherjee, who is the director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School, and she's a globally recognized advocate, practitioner, and voice for immigrants, asylum seekers, and unaccompanied migrant children. She has also been, before being part of Columbia, in the staff of the ACLU. Since founding the clinic in 2014, she and her students have traveled to both sides of the Mexico-United States border, providing pro bono counsel representing individual asylum seekers, all mothers and children, and working also on the enforcement of the Flores Settlement Agreement, which sets a limit on the length of time children can be detained in federal immigration custody, requires that they be held in less restrictive areas, and warrants access to basic hygiene and adequate nutrition. Her first-hand report on the inhumane conditions of confinement for children in a U.S. border detention center sparked national and international outreach and brought her to testify before Congress. She regularly collaborates with other immigrant rights advocates on strategic litigation, legislative reform, grassroots activism, public education, and coalition building. We also have with us, thank you, Laura, Nara Milanic, who's a professor of history at Barnard College and the director of the Center for Mexico and Central America at Columbia University. Her scholarly interests include modern Latin American comparative histories of family, gender, childhood, reproduction, law, and social inequality. Her research has been supported by the Fulbright Commission for Educational Exchange, the Social Science Research Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, UNESCO, and the American Council of Learning Society. Nara has also developed a very popular course for our undergrads to teach research skill to support asylum seekers in the United States, and had led the efforts that we had since the university to work with migrants relocated to New York City. And last but not least, we have Daniel Najux, did I pronounce it right? Who's a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs. He focuses primarily on issues related to international migration and development and homeland diaspora relations. He has published widely on the effects of migration on social, economic, and political developments, ethnic identity, and the role and genesis of public policies regarding migration. Daniel has also been working on development, migration, and population affairs at the United Nations Development Programme, the ECU Joint Migration and Development Initiatives, and the UN Population Division, UNICEF, and the ILO. The regional focus of his work is South Asia, the US, and Europe, but he has also conducted analysis and led projects in other regions, including South America. Thank you very much to all of you for agreeing to participate, and let's start with Federico. Thank you, Federico. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you very much. Thank you to Columbia University and Gustavo, Carlota, who worked a lot in the exhibition, also with Alejandra, who was a designer. And thank you to all my colleagues in the panel. Thank you very much. I would like to start in the same way as the exhibition started, talking about migration from Venezuela to Colombia. So I'm going to share my screen here, share some pictures with you. In about 10 years ago, the Venezuelans started fleeing their country due to economic and social collapse. And most of them leave the country by foot. They had to walk from many cities to the border between Venezuela and Colombia and enter Colombia. They used 3 points to enter the country. One in the north, Maicao, one in the center, Cucuta, and one in the flatlands called Arauca. These migrants were looking for work, basic food, a roof, education for their families. And that was the first wave of Venezuelan migration coming to Colombia. These people were walking next to roads in unknown places. It was very complicated because they were not using smartphones to understand the route. They were not using maps. They were not using Google for information about the places where they were going. Sometimes I found them riding big trucks, like here, where you can see dozens of people riding in the back of a truck between Cucuta and Bucaramanga. Those are two populations near the border. And usually in a car, it takes you 3 to 4 hours to make the journey. But if you have to walk, it's up to 4 or 5 days. You have to climb the mountain very high, face the cold of the altitude, and then go down. And if you're not prepared enough to walk, it's going to be very painful, very dangerous, and you could even die. These are the bridges communicating Venezuela and Colombia, but now those bridges are not working anymore. The current president is trying to open the bridges and reestablish relations between Colombia and Venezuela, but honestly it has been very difficult for both governments to agree, and also for the society. After that, after that, there was another wave of Venezuelans, most of them indigenous. There was Venezuelans from the north of the country, and they were not heading to Colombia, but south to Brazil. They exit in a small town called Santa Elena del Guairén and enter Brazil in a town called Pacaraima. This was a refugee for indigenous who were migrating from the top of the Orinoco River in Venezuela to Brazil. They had nothing, no money, no food, and the language barrier was very high. Some of them speak their native tongue, some speak Spanish, but when they reached the Brazil border, they found that in Brazil there was Portuguese, and none of them knew how to speak Portuguese. This was the shelter where more than 500 indigenous spent years. And this was part of the route. This grandmother and his grandchild were traveling in a truck for 3 days. There was an epidemic of measles also in the indigenous population because they had not been vaccinated. After that, the COVID hits, COVID-19. And when COVID-19 hits, the first people to lose their jobs in Colombia were Venezuelans. Some of them were working in red lights. Some of them had like jobs at gas stations, supermarket, things like that. And they lost their jobs. And immediately their economy crashes, collapses again, like the family economy. So they had to walk back to Venezuela and they start the journey back. The same journey they had to make it into Colombia 3, 5, 7 years ago. They walk it back from Bogota to Cucuta. With Julie Turkowitz, who's my partner at the New York Times, we follow this family. This woman is Jessica, and he is Sebastian. Sebastian was 7 years old when they exit Bogota. She was working in a flower shop, and they lost their jobs. This is a very big group of Venezuelans waiting in Bucaramanga to be to ride buses to Cucuta, also heading back. And this was Amado and her mother, Roraima, also trying to reach the border. Some of them have to ride trucks, illegal trucks, and then they made it to the border. And when they enter the country and they find their houses, they found nothing, and they found that the situation was much worse than what they left. Jessica came back to Colombia, and her son, Josnaiber, was born in Bucaramanga. She was in very bad condition. And after that, they made it to Bogota, where they are currently living. But in 2021, the Darien Gap, who used to be clandestine path for Cubans and just a few Venezuelans and some people from other countries, it was like the gap opened the doors, and suddenly there were thousands of Haitian migrants crossing the Darien Gap. I don't know if it was just coincidence or if it was related, but this started happening after the Haitian president Jovenel Moïse was killed in Haiti. So I head to Darien Gap to witness what was happening there. And what I found was thousands of Haitians facing the danger in Darien Gap. This is just the first camp. And to reach the first camp, they had to walk 8 hours under the sun inside the jungle. There were families traveling together, not just men's, but families with babies and also with elders. And the jungle started becoming like a traffic jam of people trying to reach Panama, cross all Central America by foot, and finally reach the border between Mexico and the United States. The trek was so dangerous, not only because it's a jungle, but because most of the people is not prepared to do something like this for several days. This woman fainted from exhaustion. Most of them were dehydrated. They had no food. They had no water, not shelter, nothing. Just fleeing for their lives, walking inside an unknown jungle for several days. This is Bajo Chiquito. It's the first indigenous town in Panama, in one of the routes where the police were taking the migrants, creating a database and also putting them in buses from the southern border of Panama to the north border between Panama and Costa Rica. A few months ago, one of these buses crashed and killed also dozens of migrants. And that was just the beginning, because at the end of last year, we went back to the Darien Gap with Julie Turkowitz on assignment for the New York Times. And what we saw was that the numbers were just rising. And there was more than 2,000 people crossing the jungle. So what in 2021 was a majority of Haitians crossing the jungle turned that for 2022, the majority was Venezuelans. And in 2023, there are Ecuadorians also on the top of migrant numbers. This is how the jungles looks like now. This used to be a pristine jungle. And this used to be a path for one person. Now some places look like avenues of people. You can find trash all along the way, families walking together. This was Melissa. She was 4 years old, and his father was so exhausted. He was not able to keep walking anymore. He had to sit down and recover his breath. This was part of the family of Olga, a woman who was a nurse, Venezuelan nurse working in Colombia, and then all the family decided to go there. And this picture in the center, you're going to find a guy wearing blue sweater, holding the hand of a young girl. His name is Gabriel Infante, and he was a trombone player in Venezuela. He came to Colombia and tried to find a job, tried to make a life, but it was really difficult for him as a migrant. So he decides to migrate. And that girl he's holding her hand is not his daughter. It's just somebody he met on during the trekking. And I remember walking next to Gabriel, and he was singing child songs to this girl to keep her up during the hard walking. This woman lose her foot, collapse, and after she felt, she was screaming. I thought she had a broken bone or something. The next day she was bleeding, and she told us she thought she has lost her baby on that fall. And this was a baby 2 months old. Like, you find all kinds of families there in the Darien Gap. This was a family of 4 also, and they were so stuck in the mud, and the mother was crying because she was desperate that she was not going to make it. And these people were trapped in a community called Carreto. No, sorry. I forgot the name of the community right now, but these people were being asked to pay a fee to be able to exit this indigenous town in the middle of the jungle. Now we are seeing a lot of migrants also from other places of the world, lots of migrants from Africa, Southeast Asia, China, lots of people from every place of the world. This guy did the whole Darien Gap, 9 days walking with just one leg. Joshua was his name. And this was Alejandro and his son. They were traveling also with a very group, all family. This is a story I would suggest you to read in the New York Times. This is a story of Sarah. Sarah is the little girl, and that man is Angel. And the mother asked Angel for a little help. Angel started helping the girl, and suddenly the mother starts like being back. And when Angel noticed it, there was no mother at all. Like, the mother was like several days behind. So Sarah and the mother was separated for several days. But if you read the article in the New York Times, you're going to find the words of Julie Turco is much more interesting, telling the story of Sarah, Angel, and Alexa, his mother. And this was the family of Hamlet Ortega and his 3 daughters trying to cross the jungle. They went from Venezuela to Peru, and they tried to make a life there. He was trying to work and try to put the girls to attend school, and it was impossible for him. So some of the girls attend school, some of them don't. And at the end, they decide to go to the States. It was the idea of the girls. And this is Hamlet, exhausted, devastated, because it's not just the physical weight, it's also a very emotional situation, because every step you think you're not going to make it to the end. During the last days of trekking the jungle, you start crossing rivers, and the rivers are very dangerous. Like, we have heard about lots of people dying because the rivers grow suddenly and take people. Here you can see a human chain of people trying to cross from one side to the other to reach the camp. And this is the final camp where you, after 9 days crossing the jungle, the migrants find the Panamanian police, and they know they reach their goal, at least in Panama. This was a family in a shelter in Panama. And that's all. So what we have seen in the Darien Gap, in the roads from Venezuela to Colombia, from Venezuela to Brazil, and from Colombia to Venezuela, is a path of desperate hope. Is people trying to find a roof, a job, some food, and a school for their kids. And I don't know how, but by now, what I have seen from migration policies from all the countries around is that things are not working for migrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. Is this on? Yeah. So this has been an incredible presentation, and I'm going to ask people in the panel to reflect on this presentation. So maybe I'm starting with Nadia, and she can tell us, where do we have people coming from across the hemisphere, and why are on the move, and why the Darien Gap, why they chose that as like the route of migration.
Sure. Thanks, Vicky. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone today. And Federico, I'm so happy that we got to see your photos, because I think that it's so difficult to actually convey the level of desperation, of bravery, of endurance, and the treachery that migrants going through the Darien Gap have to face on a daily and weekly and monthly and yearly basis. And Federico's photos are so incredibly powerful and compelling, and I think they do an incredible job of conveying a part of the the situation that is happening in the Darien Gap. One question that I have found come up so often when people learn about how dangerous this journey is, particularly from government officials, is, why, if this route is so dangerous, do migrants bother taking it? Why don't they simply go another way? And the answer is usually because they can't. And I think that the Darien Gap gained popularity as a route because doors were closing everywhere else. So several years ago, we started seeing that Europe was closing its doors, the US and Canada were further closing their doors, and the number of crises happening around the world had not declined. And in fact, we see that they're increasing for a multitude of reasons. People continue to have to leave their homes, whether that's due to violence, humanitarian crises in their country, climate change related reasons, economic reasons. But I think it's safe to say that they all fit in under the umbrella that people often find that life is no longer tenable in their home country, and they have to leave. So where do they go? If they want to reach North America, there are very limited legal pathways for them to do that now. I think that, with so many people on the move, it becomes natural that wherever there are openings, people are going to take them. And in South America, there's a couple of countries, namely Ecuador, Brazil, that have more lax visa policies and will accept people flying in from, many more countries around the world than the US, for example. If you go to West Africa, you'll see travel agencies that have signs in their windows saying visa-free travel. And that's how a lot of people end up selecting their journey. They go into a travel agency and ask, where can I go where I don't need a visa because I have a really inconvenient passport from Congo or from Bangladesh. And that's how the route basically opens up. So several years ago, we started seeing a real uptick in the number of people who were flying from places as far away as South Asia, the Middle East, Africa to South America and then making their way upland to the Darien Gap. And as we know, the reason that they can't continue by bus or car or, boat through the Darien Gap is because it's roadless and because they don't have the right visa. It is illegal for them to transit across the border into Panama. So they all get funneled into the Darien Gap. I think it's fascinating when you think about that. Here you have one of the most isolated places in the entire world. There's several indigenous communities, but that's literally it. Yet you see this microcosm of the entire globe. Every year there's over 80 people from 80 nations crossing the Darien Gap. I went several years before Federico, and there were 24,000 migrants crossing in 2019. It's over 10 times that much now. When I crossed, about half the people were from Haiti. They had been living in Chile and Brazil for several years, and life became untenable because they could no longer get work permits. They experienced severe racism, and in order to make a livelihood, they were forced northwards. The other half of migrants that we came across were from South Asia and Africa. A lot of people from Yemen, from Cameroon, because of the conflicts happening in those countries. More and more people were leaving India with the rise of nationalism and Modi's policies. And so what you see in the Darien Gap is really a barometer of the crises around the world. And those crises are in flux and they're constantly changing. So the situation that Federico witnessed several years later, I think, was a reflection of new migration patterns. Some crises that had grown, even more entrenched, like the Venezuelan crisis, Venezuelan migrants who had scattered across the continent and could no longer, sustain a livelihood and decided to travel north. So I think the Darien Gap can tell us so much about what is happening in other parts of the world. And it is also a reflection of the different immigration and migration policies around the world that basically funnel all of these migrants into this isolated patch of jungle in the isthmus.
I have a question. I want to follow up maybe with Daniel on this point of other migrants. It seems that in many recent migrants to the US that just come through the Darien Gap said that this is kind of the worst nightmare of the journey they survive. So can you give us a sense, if just we're starting to say of the isolation, of what migrants go when they're traversing the Darien Gap? And also, I guess maybe Federico wants to say something, given that you both have been there. So why don't you start, Nadia, and then we give it to Federico.
Sure. I'll just really briefly mention, lack of preparation. Many migrants simply have no idea what awaits them. They don't know how many days to pack food for. Has really struck me is that as the popularity of this route has grown, there's still no church groups or NGOs at the beginning of this route, or citizens groups that perhaps, help to warn migrants what they need for this journey. And this is very unlike in some parts of Europe, where groups get together to basically help migrants prepare. They create a humanitarian corridor. The Darien Gap is the exact opposite of that. So simple pieces of information, like how many days could it take to cross the Darien Gap, could go a long way to help migrants. I think that most of the dangers of the Darien Gap that we hear about are the physical dangers, and Federico mentioned a lot of those: rivers that swell, deluges that happen, river crossings. Many people who cross the Darien Gap They lose their babies, they lose their wives, they lose their children simply because they can't hold on to them when they're crossing a river because the current surprises them. And many others die of simple injuries that when you're in an area where there is no help, where as you saw in Federico's pictures, you have to drag yourself through waist-high mud, simple injuries become life-threatening. You get lost and suddenly you don't have food for the next 14 days. So there's immense physical dangers. There's also wildlife that is, venomous snakes, wild boars. But I do want to mention the human source of danger because for many people, that is even greater than the geographical risks of crossing the Darien Gap. Federico, I'd love to hear what it's like now, but when we crossed, pretty much every group of migrants crossing was robbed of everything that they owned, from passports, money, food to clothing. And many, many women were sexually assaulted or raped. Migrants who didn't give up their possessions were sometimes murdered. The assaults on migrants were systematic. It was almost a guarantee at the time. It was widely known that this was happening, and authorities who I spoke with in Panama seemed absolutely unconcerned about this. I think it's ironic, and maybe Federico can talk about this, but from what I understand, today, a paramilitary group, a group of, an organized crime group in the Darien Gap has helped to organize the travel of migrants, taking a fee for doing so. But from what I understand, it's actually safer now than it used to be. And I think as we've so often seen in areas of conflict, sometimes the social order that is imposed by certain armed groups oddly serve a protective, inevitably serve a protective purpose and do more to protect people than authorities do. So I'd love to hear what Federico has to say about that.
Okay, I would like to start answering that from this point. A migrant who decide to cross Darien Gap is not someone just trying to test his luck. It's not someone trying to see if it's going to work or not. And, like most of us have made those decisions when we were young. It's like, okay, I'm going to try this job. I'm going to try this city. I'm going to try, that kind of thing. Is not like that for migrants. A migrant who decide to cross the Darien Gap is because he is at the bottom of his hope. He's basically hopeless, and that's what you see in Necoclí, which is the last town in Colombia before crossing the Darien Gap. These people is hopeless. Their chances to go back to their home cities or where they come from and rebuild their lives is zero. Either if they are Ecuadorian fleeing violence, Haitians living in Chile facing racism, Venezuelans fleeing their own country facing the economic collapse, whatever it is, most of the migrants, most of them are at a no return point. And that's important to understand this population of migrants crossing the Darien Gap. Because also there's a common question, and I really like that Nadja start why taking this route, and I think Nadja explained it very well. But also some people have asked me when they see my photos, like why these people is bringing their kids in such a dangerous place. And the explanation is very simple. It's because or they bring their kids with them and take the high risk of losing their lives and their kids' life, or they have to decide to migrate and never see their kids again. So it's not an easy decision. So about the violence, it's really bad, keeps being bad, and I think it keeps growing. There's a lot of people who has been robbed. There's a lot of people who has been sexually assaulted, and there's a lot of people who has been killed. We saw while crossing a lot of dead bodies, There's a lot of dead people in the Darien Gap. And the problem is that there is no authorities to report that. There are no numbers that you can rely on to report that, because it's the jungle and because there's no like state presence in the Darien Gap itself. So that's really complicated. But also what happened with the violence at large is that the migrant will is to arrive. Most of them are heading to the United States, some of them also Canada, but their will is to arrive, and to arrive as soon as they can, start working, find a job, find a house, find a school, find some food, and that's it.
Okay.
So one of the situations is that they made it to Panama, they reached the authorities, but if they complain about violence, robbery, and anything, they're going to be held there for as long as the case takes. So they decide not to say a word about what's happening in the Darien Gap, because their will is to continue as fast as they can.
Okay. Yes. Thanks, Federico. That's pretty impressive. So let me ask a little bit about the people who are not coming from Latin America, from the region. You know, we hear that now we have people coming from all over the world, from like Afghanistan, from Southeast Asia, from Africa. So Daniel, it looks like this is kind of the world map of migration and people fleeing. What's behind this and these efforts to go through the Darien Gap? And to what extent can we call these people migrants or refugees? You have been talking and working on human mobility, but how would you define these flows and the reasons behind the risk that these people are taking to make it to the United States?
Us on some of the hardships, the vulnerabilities, and make us think about the larger picture, because it's important to look at what's happening there and to really understand the hardship that people go through. But again, this is just an example of what's wrong with a broader picture. As Nadia said, the people go there because other doors are closed. And I will expand on this because in addition I want to make, but before there, our global system, we have created the externalization of borders through passport and visa regimes, through carrier sanctions. If you check in at Lufthansa, at American Airlines, you want to fly somewhere, it's a flight attendant who checks whether you have the authorization to enter where you want to go. If you tell the flight attendant, oh, but I'm fleeing persecution, that person says, I don't care. I'm just an employee of United Airlines. I'm not an official. I don't care. If I transport you to the other to the US or elsewhere, I get fined. The airline gets huge fines, so-called carrier sanctions. There are many ways how we have created a refuge beyond reach, as my colleague David Fitzgerald wrote in a book called Refuge Beyond Reach. It's very hard for anybody to legally migrate, to seek refuge. And again, sometimes you think, oh, that's just a byproduct that people use Darien Gap. Whereas the weaponization of territory is something that governments the world overuse. They build walls somewhere, they push migrants into territory, into deserts, into these areas where they know it's harder. They know people will go there, but they think it's maybe the pull factor of making it easy is lower. Hence, making it harder, the journey will push some people, will make them think twice before they migrate. Before I get to the non-hemispheric migration, there are Cubans who pass the Darien Gap. If you have the map of the US and of Cuba, if you're on Cuba and you look north, you kind of see the Keys. You can just like row over there. Like, why would anybody from Cuba just go south and then make this long way, right? It doesn't make sense from an effectiveness. I'm German, I love effectiveness, right? And it doesn't make any sense for me. It's all about certain visa policies. And maybe Laura can later tell about the changes in Cuban policies that actually made Cubans change. They had a very easy way for them earlier, and then they changed. We have the story about an Afghan elite soldier who was head of a key unit fighting against the Taliban. Then the Taliban obviously took over the country, and who had to flee. And because of his position, the very elite soldier had a cooperation with the US Army. He would have been eligible for a visa to join the US. So here, the door was actually not closed. There was an open door, a special visa for people who cooperated with the United States while being in Afghanistan. However, and there's always an however, that's a long process. There's a long backlog. It would take months and months. And it would be very unsafe for that person to stay in Afghanistan. So that person decided to take a flight to save money and to go, and he went somewhere else. He made some money, and then he passed the Darien Gap, right? Hoping that once he reaches the southern border of the United States, there he can say, "Oh, by the way, I should get the special status. I'm your ally. We worked hand in hand." But that's a kind of a problem. Somalis. In Somalia, civil war. In most countries, Somalis are recognized as refugees. The UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, estimates about 850,000 Somali refugees. Most of them in neighboring countries of Somalia. More than 50% are in Kenya and Uganda alone. But most of them, and then there's droughts, and we have Dr. Dershabinen in the audience, who is one of the leading experts on climate mobility and the links that climate has on displacement. And of course, the drought that happened in Somalia and the Horn of Africa and other factors exacerbated the needs of Somalis to actually leave the country, including to Al-Shabaab, terrorist group that really terrorizes parts of the country. But in the neighboring countries, there has been this protected displacement for 20, for 30 years. Refugees have been warehoused, have been in refugee camp in Kenya, in the Dadaab refugee camps, with no real opportunities for development. So if you are leaving Somalia and we think going to Dadaab, where maybe have some safety, there's some issues, but I don't have a chance for my children, right? So there are people who've been forced thinking about the world and seeking other ways of moving. From China, we see Chinese coming. No, they reportedly actually have hiking boots, and they come a little better prepared than others. But human mobility flows are a lot more. Migration and mobility is a quintessential adaptation strategy. We all, if something bad happens, we think, "Oh, we move," and many of us do that. And in many cases, it's a good adaptation strategy. But sometimes are these huge, what we call a maladaptation strategy, or something what happens on the long, which exacerbates a lot of these vulnerabilities. The people we see crossing the Darien Gap are not just some low-skilled people who have no other things. They're middle-class people. They're nurses. They are doctors. This elite soldier who was at the top, he was, I don't know, like ranks. I'm not in the military, right? They're really elite people who have no other choices. And people who often we would want. And people who have drive, they have ideas, have innovation. Again, looking at them only through the victimization lens, through the vulnerability lens, is also a problem, right? There are people who we think, "Oh, they could actually help us with our aging societies, with a society that need manpower and innovation and ideas." But the global system is geared up. And one thing that I really that made me think about the global mobility term that I use a lot. Some of them would qualify as asylum seekers and refugees, and they should immediately get asylum. They don't, and I think Professor Mukherjee will later talk a little bit more about that. Some of them are migrants, and some are in this space where it's kind of forced. Maybe it's kind of what my colleague Alexander Betz called survival migration, which they need to move, they will die, but it's not a recognized refugee ground for persecution. And some of them is return migration. Some of it is they moved to one country, they couldn't make it, and they are the most vulnerable because they are outsiders and of citizenship status. They have the jobs that are most vulnerable to recession and to COVID induced job loss. So they have to move again. Right? We've seen this, and Friedrich talked about this, about secondary migration. People have moved again. People who've moved back to Venezuela, maybe they moved again. So this kind of, it's not just one move. It's often people who are on the move are forced. They sometimes would like to settle down, but they have to move again. And we have to think a little bit what that means. What if somebody once was a refugee, like by international standards, that will always be a refugee, right? But it's akin still to economic migration. Again, the refugee scholars will probably try to strangle me, but that person is now in search for better livelihoods, and we don't have means to actually account for that in our policy, in our legal framework. So I think it's the microcosmos of the Darien crossing makes us think about the policies and the global and the inequities and the structural deficiencies in the global system of regular orderly migration that we think about, and about the protection system.
Thank you. So let's talk about when these people reach the United States, I guess. What happened when these migrants and asylum seekers arrive to the US border? This is often constructed politically as a border crisis in the US. But what is the US doing when these people arrived, and what is that the US should be doing when these people arrive? And let's have Laura and then Nara maybe talk about it.
Okay, thank you, Vicky. Thank you for organizing the panel. Federico, your photographs are so moving and touching. And thank you to my co-panelists and for all of you for coming out this afternoon to learn about these issues and how you might get involved. So this is going to be a very short overview of the Refugee Convention and then how the United States is not upholding its obligations under the Refugee Convention at the border today. So the Refugee Convention was negotiated among Western countries in the wake of World War II in an effort to make sure that Western countries did not turn away bona fide refugees after the horrors of the Holocaust. And the United States government incorporated the protections of the Refugee Convention into domestic law in 1980 with the passage of the Refugee Act. The Refugee Act provides extensive protections and extensive regulations for how asylum seekers and refugees must be treated and processed once they are in this country. And in very broad brushstrokes, from about 1980 through 2020, more or less, and so with some egregious exceptions, the US government basically sought to uphold the protections of the Refugee Convention as incorporated into domestic US law. That changed in 2020 with the Trump administration. The Trump administration enacted a policy under the guise of the public health COVID-19 pandemic called Title 42. Title 42 is a citation to the Public Health Code of the United States, and there's a provision there that allows for the expulsion of migrants, according to the Trump and Biden administrations, including asylum seekers, based on public health grounds. Stephen Miller was the architect of anti-immigrant policies under the Trump administration, and he had for years before 2020 suggested using Title 42 as a mechanism for blocking migrants from coming to the United States, especially at the southern border. And the COVID-19 pandemic gave him the pretext to issue this public health order. The public health order was signed by the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. And at the time, the top experts, scientists, doctors at the CDC said, this order is not necessary to protect public health. But it was issued by the Trump administration, and it empowered Customs and Border Patrol agents not to follow the Refugee Act of 1980, but instead, which has a whole set of protocols that are supposed to be followed for processing asylum seekers, and instead empowered Customs and Border Patrol agents to follow the Title 42 expulsion order. What does this mean in practice? It means in practice that since 2020, there have been more than 1 million migrants who have been migrants, including asylum seekers, trying to come to the United States. But instead of being processed appropriately, and instead of determining whether each person has a credible fear of persecution in their home country, they're summarily expelled under the Title 42 order. So most of these encounters with CBP agents take place in the desert, in the plains, in other places along the border, and the expulsions take place typically in about 15 minutes. The CBP agent finds, apprehends the person, and then quickly turns them back to Mexico. So the Biden administration had an opportunity to rescind Title 42 once the Biden administration came to power. They did not. Instead, the Biden administration has consistently relied on Title 42. There was a point in about a year and a half ago when the Biden administration sought to rescind the Title 42 order. That was rejected by a federal district court in a lawsuit brought by southern border states and other conservative GOP-led attorney generals in the lawsuit. So that effort was enjoined. And since then, the Biden administration has actually expanded reliance on Title 42. Last October, the Biden administration expanded Title 42 to apply to Venezuelan migrants and asylum seekers who are now also subjected to summary expulsions. Since then, this January, the Biden administration has further expanded reliance on Title 42 by applying this expulsion power to nationals from Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua. And it remains to be seen what will happen with Title 42. The expectation is that the Biden administration will no longer rely on Title 42 once the COVID-19 National Public Health Emergency Order is lifted. That order is expected to be lifted on May 11th of this year. And in the meantime, the Biden administration has proposed regulations that would make it even more difficult to apply for asylum and seek humanitarian protections in the United States. And I can talk about that at some later point if it's of interest to folks.
Nara, you want to add anything?
Sure. So I just want to thank Federico, first of all, for his wonderful work for bringing home, obviously, the human dimensions of this issue. And I want to talk about a couple of things. First, we might be tempted to look at those photographs and think, sort of, this is a humanitarian crisis that kind of comes out of nowhere. It's a meteor that hits unfortunate people, and it is what it is. But I think what our conversation is sort of surfacing is that this is a politically produced crisis. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not intractable or unavoidable. It is produced by a series of political decisions that different governments around the world and different societies around the world take about their attitudes towards mobility and migration. The other reason that I think Federico's photographs are so important is because they invite us to shift our geographic gaze. So much of the conversation about immigration in the United States today focuses on the US-Mexico border. And it's understandable why that would be, right? That is sort of the gateway, the entryway. It is the litmus test. It is the political focus. If you have, turned on Fox News in the past, few months, if you managed to stomach that, you will find, the US-Mexico border, this sort of constant drumbeat. But one of the things that I think that this panel can emphasize, and a focus on the Darien can emphasize, is the extent to which this is not a problem of the US-Mexico border per se. It is not a problem or challenge only for the United States. This is a hemispheric issue, and I think some of the comments of the panelists have already brought to light the extent to which it is a hemispheric, as well as, of course, a global issue. And I think that any conversation around migration today really needs to grapple with that fact. That this is a regional, hemispheric, and global issue, and any sort of solutions that we can imagine must come out of regional conversations and collaborations. So maybe I would just say that.
Thank you, Nara. And that brings me to my last question, I mean, not my penultimate question, which is on the recent fire on the immigration detention facility in Mexico that caused at least 40 migrants to die last week. And that has drawn attention to the impact of border externalization. So what does mean for these migrants that are trying to reach the United States, the role that other countries play in enforcing US policy of border enforcement, Mexico for sure, Panama as well, as we just heard Federico describing. I mean, Mexico, not just in the northern border, but also in the southern border with Guatemala. So I would like to hear maybe Nadia and Nara to discuss a little bit these aspects, since it builds on Nara's comment as well.
Sure.
And you want to say something as well, Daniel, whomever.
Maybe I'll let Nara talk about Mexico, but one of the things that was so fascinating to witness in the Darien Gap was to see this tiny little outpost. It was a prefabricated shack just on, you know, the end of the trail that migrants take. It's the first indigenous community. Federico had photographed it, Bajo Chiquito, that many migrants come across as they come out. And in this prefab shack is basically a station that takes biometric information from migrants and it cross-checks their information with the FBI, various international databases to ensure that there are no criminals and terrorists passing through Panama. So this is an actual physical outpost of US border enforcement that we witnessed as far south as Panama. I think that, you know, we hear on Fox News and elsewhere of these surprise surges and waves of nationalities that, you know, we never associate with the US-Mexico border, such as Afghans, Yemenis, Eritreans. And wow, what a surprise. We haven't seen these people here before. We didn't know they were coming. The US government knows pretty much every single person who is passing through the Darien Gap en route to the US because they have this program with Panama that registers the biometric information of every person who comes out of the Darien Gap. If there are any red flags, that migrant cannot continue on. Many of them have to wait weeks, if not months, in this outpost of the Darien Gap until they get cleared by Panamanian authorities to continue on their journey. So I think it's quite stunning to see just how far south the US border enforcement actually extends and even finds its way in these very isolated parts of countries, even further south than Panama, but this is just one example in the Darien Gap.
This is actually, thank you for the great question, Vicky. An example, so when you think about this, like when you hear the stories, you think, okay, when we crest the Darien Gap, they might just be at the southern border of the US, but they're not. Right? They're still really far away. There's several countries they have to go through in Central America and Northern America, like Mexico, in order to go to this border and to go to the promised land of the United States of America. The US now has started to learn from Europe and other countries to create buffer zones, to cooperate with other countries and create safe first countries of asylum and safe third countries, and say, okay, if you have been there, asylum, for example, is just you can't just forum shopping, you can't just go wherever you want to go. If you had a chance to apply in that country, we send you back there. Europe is very good. They created a lot of ideas about how to say, well, you had to go through Turkey. For us, Turkey is a safe country. You have no right to apply for asylum here, which is we can talk about the legal implication for that, but it's a very de facto publication and like cooperating with other countries. And the US has tried to do this with Mexico. They have for the long time tried to the Frontera Sur, the border at the southern border of Mexico, to reinforce that, because they thought if fewer people enter Mexico, then fewer people enter the US on the southern border of the US, right? So putting up more and more barriers and having these cooperation agreements with other countries to say, okay, we erect you as a buffer zone. We give you some money. There's often exchanges of foreign aid and like very politicized, not good use of ODA, of official development assistance. But again, this is a way how the global system, how the global North is trying to shield itself. And what, again, Deb Fitzgerald, whose book I mentioned earlier, called the Catch-22, where the US and other countries in the global North say, of course, we believe in refugee protections. If people come here, they're bona fide refugees, of course, we uphold their rights to protection, or their claims to protection. However, de facto, they make sure that those people do not come here. And one of the few issues of the global, or the challenges of the global protection regime is that we only have a right to claim asylum in situ, sur place. You have to put your foot on the soil of the country and then say asylum. If you're still 100 meters away and you say asylum, they say, I don't hear you, I don't have to hear you, right? So that's one of the issues that we have, and why humanitarian visa and facilitating migration, getting people out of those, what we actually want from a human rights perspective, that would be our obligation to help them, right? But states don't want to do that because they fear political backlash and being a pull factor. But again, these shortcomings of the global system of protection, which then expand to other forms of migration, are really at the core of why these externalizations do work.
I was just going to add one small comment, and that is, I like to sort of think about the hubris of deterrence. The idea that border regimes can force people to stay home, which, and I think we're all sort of in agreement with that. And this is the interesting thing about, I think, this issue is it seems so extraordinarily intractable. And yet we're all kind of on the same page about what works or doesn't work, or what's going to happen, or, you know, sort of the big picture. And yet, of course, we see governments often doing exactly the opposite thing. And deterrence and sort of regimes of deterrence is a really excellent example of that. This sort of fundamental hubris that, you know, separating parents from their children at the border, or putting people in jail, or throwing them back over on the other side of the border and putting them in detention centers where they die in fires, is somehow going to convince people not to come. If there's anything that we have seen in recent years, I think if there's anything that we have learned about mobility in the hemisphere and the world in recent years, it's that all of those horrific things, as horrific as they are, will not convince people who cannot viably live in the place where they start off to stay there. So regimes of deterrence have a frankly unlimited capacity to impose suffering on human beings. They have the capacity to encourage you know, trafficking and criminal networks and the greater exploitation of vulnerable people on the move. But the one thing that they don't do is stop people from moving.
Thank you, Nara. So the Darien is almost 5,000 miles from where we're sitting, but in a sense, it has become connected to New York City as a result of US migration policy, and not just national, but also local and state level, and the fact that many of these migrants have been passed literally to New York City. So I would like Laura to talk about what can be done in the US in terms of policy with migrants and asylum seekers that have reached the US despite all of these efforts to deter them. And maybe then afterwards, Carnara, to talk about community involvement and what can be done in that aspect. So.
Sure. So Nara, your comments are reminding me of what a refugee poet, Warshan Shire, once wrote. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And those words were resonating in my mind, Federico, as I was looking at your photographs. So here in the United States, asylum seekers, bona fide asylum seekers, have a chance to seek protections. The asylum seeker, the asylum system, the immigration system in the United States is literally broken. There is a backlog of more than 1.5 million cases in immigration courts nationwide. There are an additional more than 800,000 applications for asylum pending before an agency called U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. You know, asylum seekers in the United States, unfortunately, many of them are forced to wait for months, if not years, for resolution on their legal claims. Our clinic has been representing some clients since 2015 and 2016 who've done everything possible to try and have their asylum cases heard by the US government, but because of massive backlogs, it's just not been possible. The other thing that's worth noting is that by this May, immigrants, those who are watching the immigration system, expect to see a seismic shift in immigration law, similar to what Daniel was just speaking about. The Biden administration will very likely introduce what immigrants' rights advocates have called the transit ban regulation. And that will require that asylum seekers in the United States first seek protection in a country of transit that they've traveled through before coming to the United States. And if they haven't sought protection in any country of transit and been denied protection there, a process that literally could take years, then they will be removed from the United States. They will be deported from the United States. Many of the asylum seekers will need to meet this threshold of consideration in the hours and days after they've crossed into the United States while they are in immigration detention centers without any access to legal counsel, without even knowing this requirement. So that was a very depressing answer. But let me also say that for any of you who are considering working with asylum seekers and migrants in the United States, it is an incredibly fulfilling professional role. For those of you who might be thinking about law school, being an immigration lawyer can be a very fulfilling way to make a life for yourself. And there are also so many ways to support asylum seekers and migrants in the United States outside of being a lawyer in the system. And for that, I'll turn to Nara.
Thank you. So since last spring, some 50,000 newcomers have arrived to New York City. That those folks periodically appear in the newspaper and then disappear again. There was sort of an uptick in August, September, October, and then the issue sort of disappeared again. But most of those people are still in New York. And here we can think again about the geography. If a panel and images of the Darien invite us to think about migration as a hemispheric issue, I think we can also think about the ways that Darien, in a sense, runs right through Midtown Manhattan. And that is because many of those 50,000 people who have arrived in the past 9 or so months have traveled through this area and have stories about it. And last semester, I had the opportunity to participate in a neighborhood group, just a group of neighbors on the Upper West Side who mobilized to support new neighbors, recent migrants who had arrived at a hotel on 107th Street. And one of the most sort of powerful memories that I will have of those experiences was sitting in a church basement on the Upper West Side with a group of women. It was a group we called the Junta de Vecinas, the neighbor group, consisting of old neighbors and new neighbors, which is to say people who have long been in New York and those who had just arrived, to sort of hash out some of the needs and priorities of new neighbors and to think about ways that the neighbors might mobilize to support them. So I came to this meeting with a very long list of items to discuss. We should discuss what to do about those donations and how everybody's going to get pants and what should we do about legal screenings. And two of the women who were recently arrived, both of them Venezuelan, started chatting with each other and with everyone else. There was probably 5 or 6 of us sitting around the table. And the meeting hadn't started yet, and they started talking about their journey. They had arrived maybe two weeks before in New York, and they started talking about the Darien. And they talked, and they talked, and they didn't stop talking. And we never ended up having the meeting because they talked for an hour and a half about what they had seen, what they had experienced. So they were clearly carrying that experience with them, of all of the many things that they'd experienced on the journey, of all of the many things that they had experienced that had caused them to take the decision to move in the first place. The Darien was really central to what they were thinking about in that moment. So that was extraordinarily impactful. So those 50,000 people who have arrived are the lucky ones, right? They are the ones who survived, who had traversed the mud and the snakes and the swelling rivers, the people who have made it through sometimes 12 countries to get to the border, the folks that made it over the US-Mexico border and into the interior of the US, the folks that arrived in New York, which is the only city with a so-called right to shelter of any city in the United States. So many of those folks are now in hotels in Midtown Manhattan. So they're the lucky ones. And yet the needs of this population are kind of endless, right? Or maybe endless isn't they are great. Many folks do not have, particularly Venezuelans. There's less of a history of Venezuelan migration, so people are not arriving to kin networks and communities already made, as migrants very often do, right? Kin and community form the kind of soft landing for many migrants, but many of those folks that have arrived in New York City don't have that soft landing, so they arrive in hotels with no job and no pants, literally. And no legal status. So there are a wealth of opportunities in the city to support new neighbors. There are mutual aid organizations, there are churches and synagogues, there are neighborhood groups, there are advocacy organizations, there are immigrant rights groups that have been doing this work and know how to do it for a very long time. And so we wanted as a panel to invite all of you in the audience to explore how you might be able to support the new neighbors that have joined us in New York City. And in order to do that, you can direct your attention to the beautiful QR codes around the room and at the bottom of the stage here. And I invite you to take a moment to scan the QR code, and you'll come up with a brief list of opportunities. Probably many of you know of other opportunities in the city to provide legal support, to provide material support, to provide tutoring or whatever it may be for new neighbors. And we invite you to email us with those ideas, and we will then add them to the list. So
thank you so much, Nara. So this has been great. We have very little time, so I'll take a couple of questions from the audience and then give you 1 minute maybe to each of you to talk. Okay, you there?
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Tanco. I work at the Migration Policy Institute. I'm an associate policy analyst. So we've been following this issue very closely. I'm a Mexico specialist. One thing that has been really hard to track is where are people getting the information to traverse all the way from South America to Mexico? I mean, on the one hand, you mentioned that they're not really giving.
Try to be brief because otherwise it will be a single question.
Yeah, of course. I guess I'm just wondering what's the role of different polleros, trafficking organization, if you've seen any changes in the last couple of years as the routes have changed, as the nationalities have changed, and the role of social media and technology. If you can speak to that.
Okay, and one more question there. Yes.
Can just pick it up?
Yeah.
More of a global question. With China and the US in the Cold War. What do you think would be the prospect of coordination within Southern American countries, the OAS and Mercosur, UNASUR, and the acronyms? So those kind of coordinations that the Latin Americans need to have more economic and political growth. Where do you see that going?
Coordination on what?
On migration, I guess.
It could be a migration. I mean, the root cause is poverty and economic challenges and lack of democracy. So these regional organizations are there, but nothing's done to coordinate their efforts and come to solution.
Okay, last question over here, and then we get 1 minute to each of the panelists.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk here today. Just a quick question on President Biden's visit to Canada a couple of weeks ago and the closure of Roxham Road that was announced, as well as the amendments to the third Safe Country Agreement. Just wondering to get your perspectives on the impact and the precedent that that's showing for all these other borders in the South. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll start from Daniel coming here, and we will end with Federico, 1 minute each.
Yeah, so be very brief and talk to about how can regional organizations in Latin America and other organizations help. I think for the root causes, it's really hard for any external actor to address poverty. I mean, in Venezuela right now, with the Maduro government, with the economic impacts that government has, and there's no way that there's an international organization that OAS or Mercosur or the Andean community can easily address that, right? That's the real issue. We all think the root causes should be addressed with the political or economic, but from any external actor has limited ways. So that's why I often think, like, yes, we should focus on root causes, but the root cause is such a big thing. Let's focus on migration per se and how we can make migration be less dangerous and more beneficial without losing track of the root cause. But the root cause is something that's so big that it's very hard for us to address it.
Thank you, Daniel.
Maybe in relation to the question about social media, I would say the following, and this is purely based on anecdotal observation, not any research of my own, and it speaks to conversations that I've had with Astrid, who's in the back, who is our resident expert on Venezuelan migration, and that is the following. Sitting in the basement in the church last semester, it's clear that many of the Venezuelan migrants that have arrived in New York are super tuned into social media, are very well informed, yes, rumors spread over social media, but so too disinformation, and people seem extremely plugged in. And I was struck by that because in prior work, I had spent a lot of time speaking with, for example, rural Guatemalans, and the story was completely different. People were not plugged in. People had no information about from social media or other sources about what's going on at the border, and that's, I think, part of the hubris of deterrence, is that a lot of people don't know what's going on. You can do bad things to them at the border, but if they don't know about it, right, that's it's not going to keep them from coming. So I think that just reminds us, sort of a broader point, which is the heterogeneity of migrants. We tend to say migrants and put everybody in a pile, and maybe we distinguish them by nationality, but class, rural versus urban origins, the specific challenges of indigenous migrants, linguistic challenges that they may face, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all of that is part of this story that we haven't had the opportunity to talk about, but which is a really important part of it.
So I'll address the question about the Safe Third Country Agreement between the United States and Canada. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, in 2005, Canada and the United States negotiated a treaty. The treaty said that if you're an asylum seeker who first arrives in Canada and then comes to the United States through an official border crossing, you're out of luck, because Canada was a safe country in which you should have sought asylum. So you were statutorily barred from seeking asylum in the United States. Same thing in reverse. If you're an asylum seeker who comes to the United States first, then crosses through an official border crossing to get to Canada, you are not allowed to seek asylum in Canada because you should have sought asylum in the United States. Fast forward to the Trump administration. federal litigation was filed in Canada alleging that the United States is no longer a safe country for asylum seekers. The plaintiffs in that case prevailed. That case is now on appeal, and we shall see what the appellate courts in Canada hold about whether the United States is actually a safe country for asylum seekers. More recently, about 2 weeks ago, Canada and the United States updated the Safe Third Country Agreement to say that even if you transit from one country to another between official border crossings, you are no longer permitted to seek asylum in the other country. So this was a what's been called a loophole in the law. So asylum seekers in the United States didn't feel like they could prevail here. They were concerned about the complete lack of social safety net for asylum seekers in the United States, and they unofficially crossed with an unofficial border crossing into Canada and sought asylum there, tried to seek asylum there. But that loophole has been closed so that that is no longer possible. What does this portend? This portends what I expect to see in May and thereafter, with the United States claiming that not just Canada, but many other countries in our hemisphere are safe third countries where a person must seek asylum and be denied protections before coming to the United States.
Thank you, Nadia.
I'll just really quickly address how migrants are getting information and how they're learning about smuggler networks, because I think that it changes every year to every month, probably to every week. So to put that into perspective, in 2019, when I was in the Darien Gap, you would be hard pressed to find a video, on YouTube or anywhere else on social media about the Darien Gap. As we know now, there are thousands of videos on TikTok and other forms of social media. I think that WhatsApp in particular has been an absolute lifeline for migrants, and the ability to use WhatsApp has essentially eliminated, in some cases, the need for smugglers. I think that a lot of, depending on your nationality, there are different ways of moving. And so for a lot of Africans, I found that they rarely use smugglers. They got tips from people who had already made the journey through WhatsApp, simple tips of which hotel to stay in, which town, how to take a bus to get from A to B. And smugglers were often, they rarely tapped into smuggler networks and definitely didn't plan on where they were going to get a smuggler until they actually reached a point where it was necessary to get one. Whereas in South Asia, a lot of people from Bangladesh and India tend to plan their journey far well in advance, paying great sums of money for what they often call travel agents, who essentially facilitate all of these connection points. And so when you're on your journey, you might have somebody who picks you up at the bus station or shows you which hotel to stay in, how to make a border crossing, et cetera. So this is often very country specific, and I think it's constantly evolving, but social media has really changed the way that people figure out how to move.
Thank you, Federico. You have the last word, and then I'll invite everyone to see his pictures, which are on the exhibit outside here.
Thank you, Vicky. There are now 4 routes open in the Darien Gap. The migrants decide what route to take according on how much money they can pay. There's a safer one, which is just 2 days walking, and you walk through pastures. There's a very dangerous one, which is 5 days walking, and you see lots of people dead along the trail. So that to reflect that the same situation is happening all around Central America, South America, in the border between Mexico and the United States, to all the migrants. Their status depends on how much can they pay. Their life depends on it. And at the end, I think sometimes it's not xenophobia, and as it's presented, because for wealth people who can afford a visa, who can afford a travel agency in their home countries, they can make it, and then they can find jobs, and those are open. I know several Venezuelans who were lucky enough to be able to get a visa, fly to a different country, find a job, and find a life. It's poor Venezuelans who are who have to live this nightmare, and not only Venezuelans, Cuban, Nicaraguans, Salvadorians, people from all around the world. So I think it's important also to consider that it's not just xenophobia. It's not about the nationality. It's not about the origin of these migrants, but about the economic power of the migrant itself that defines his future.
Thank you, Federico, and thank you to everyone for coming to hear this discussion. Please, I invite you to see the photographs of Federico outside, and thanks a lot for coming, and those of you who are online as well. Thank you. Thanks to the panel, to the curator, and also to the ILAS team that put this together. Gustavo in particular, but Astrid and everyone else.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.